There's no way to count the number of sandwiches you've packed over the years. Hard to imagine this day would come. Yeah, there's still the same fields, the same roads, the same hard work. But now they're in someone else's hands. And you couldn't be more proud of who you're handing the farm to. No matter what the future holds, AgCountry is here to help you plan ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Red River Farm Network Issues and Events Center. I'm farm broadcaster Kara Hart, and I have the privilege of doing an introduction for our friends at AgCountry Farm Credit Services. They're holding an educational forum here at the Big Iron Farm Show. Joining on the stage, Katie Tangen, and we have Rob Fronning. Thanks again, guys, for being here today. We can't wait to hear what you guys have to say on the COVID-19 pandemic. Take it away.
Thanks, Garrick. Thanks again. Appreciate allowing us to be here today. Also, a big welcome to those watching virtually. We are being viewed online as well. So, again, my name is Rob Fronning. I'm a VP Insurance, Commodity Marketing, and Education with AgCountry Farm Credit Services. I've been with AgCountry for about 15 years, involved with crop insurance for about 21 years or so. With me again is Katie Tangen, and maybe you want to tell them a little bit about yourself.
Yep, I'm Katie Tangen. I'm a market education specialist. I work out of the Fargo corporate office for AgCountry. I've been here in my third year. Before that, I'd worked as a broker, a market analyst, and then done some crop insurance for about 13 years. So big background, of course, eastern North Dakota, western Minnesota, which overlaps with our trade area. But there's certainly, as much as 13 years, you think you've seen a good amount of stuff. This year has been so much different than anything we've seen before.
Absolutely. 2020 has been an interesting year. Again, those of you watching virtually online, there is a website in the bottom right corner if you want to ask questions. I do have my phone with me, and I'll be watching for questions that come in. Those of you viewing us live here at Big Iron, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get you a mic to ask questions as well. You touched on it, Katie, with 2020. What a year. From just everything, whether it's markets, whether it's weather, whether it's political, it's a pandemic. Lots of things have impacted our farmers as we are growing this crop here in 2020. But what I'd like to do is I think let's start off with some good news. All right, we've had a pretty nice rally going here recently, and especially on the soybeans. Had a lot of good things happening. What do you think is really attributing to that? Is it demand or is it exports? Where do you think what's really causing this?
I think that there's a lot of things kind of coming together all at the same time, and you're right. At the beginning of the year, things kind of looked ho-hum. We understood that there was going to be some pressures, and then the COVID came in mid-March or so, really going into April. So if you go back 6 months, and I would have told you, well, 6 months from now, you're going to have the highest prices we've had in soybeans on the futures market in almost 3 years, I don't think anyone would have really believed that. And I've been like, yeah, sure, that's what's going to happen. But when we go back to when this started, it really started the day of the August WASDE report, which is interesting because that's the day USDA came out with a carryout estimate for beans, and it was over 600 million bushels, which is pretty comfortable. It was a big increase, but that was the day that despite that big increase, despite the additional bushels, we saw buyers continue to enter the market despite that news. They didn't care. And that's one signal I think a lot of times gets a little bit lost in the shuffle because it's like, oh, well, I guess it just didn't mean anything. And on the face of it doesn't, but when you see such an outright rejection of poor news, especially against seasonal tendencies, I think that's a signal we have to pay attention to. Now, that day would I have said, oh, we're going to be over $10 futures in a month? No, I probably would not have believed that either. But it is, something to keep in mind going forward. When you have such a strong rejection, it probably means a lot of that bad news might be priced in, and we're moving on to something else. Obviously, fund buying has played a huge part in this. Everyone said, well, they're as short as they've ever been, or they've been as long as they've ever been. And right now, they actually are pretty long. Those are nice metrics. It gives us fuel for a move one way or the other. If they're very, very short, it gives us fuel to move higher. If they're very, very long, it gives us fuel to move lower. But the one part that everyone always kind of forgets with marketing is time. They can hold those positions for whenever. They can hold them for 6 months. They can hold them for a year. What makes them move? And that's the part that right now we're up to long, but we also have commercials that are going into harvest and look to be relatively underbought. So we have the ability to absorb some of that sales at a time of year when we typically don't.
So again, we talked about futures, crossing that psychological point of $10 futures. So we got above that, and again a little higher than that here overnight. The other thing you talked about is with that demand. A couple of years ago, kind of when the trade war started, especially in North Dakota, we saw basis on soybeans just really expand to even off the board basis. That's something too. Given where we're at in today's circumstances, basis has stayed strong relatively. Especially for this area, and actually, look back in time, we've seen 60 cents under basis in this area, which is really attractive. Why is basis staying so strong in this area?
It normally, on an average year, I'd pencil in probably 90 under if harvest delivery, not doing anything else, maybe $1 depending where you're at. And this year we're going into harvest, and the same thing. We have a rallying futures market and a tightening basis, which is not typically the case. That is a very strong signal. And what it's a reflection of is just the tremendous amount of export business we've done in the past month and a half. I think when I looked this morning, we've had announced sales. So USDA has a rule, if you have any sales that go over 100,000 metric tons, that they have to report that. And they started doing that after the grain robbery back in the 70s. We've had announcements 28 of the last 33 business days. So there's a lot of bushels that are being moving. Well, who's buying those bushels? A lot of it's moving to unknown, which can be anywhere. A lot of times we see those sales switch to China at the last minute, and we've seen that take place. And some of them have been outright announced to China. Those go off the PNW. Well, who's first in line in terms of major production areas. It would be North Dakota and then into Minnesota. So they're trying to pull all that grain out there. I think one thing we need to say is, yes, the basis is really strong. I would expect a lot of volatility as we move through the fall and into the winter. Because of the volume of sales we have, there is going to be some questions at times on whether the ports can handle that type of capacity. So yes, you may see times where we see that dip back. But ports aren't unlike elevators that way. They will plug occasionally. So once we get through that, but generally I do expect a pretty strong basis. The other thing that's interesting that was in the September WASDE is we know, according to these announced sales, that China has already bought 8.5 million metric tons of corn from the U.S. USDA has penciled in only 7 million metric tons total imports into China. They've already bought more than that. So what does that mean? There's a couple different ways to look at it. One, they could be leaving room for some cancellations, which that would be typical too, but that seems like a lot. Part of it might be because of the tariff situation. 7 is the tariff rate quota number, so that's what they can bring in under the quota. They may have a rule that says they're not going to adjust that number higher until they get further into the marketing year. Remember, we're really early in the market. We still have almost a whole year to go before they're going to close out those books. So I think that's something that's to be watched very closely, but it's certainly business I'm not going to turn down. And as low as we fell on the downside when China put the restrictions on U.S. grain, it's kind of symmetry. We have that to the upside too. So we'll see how things go in the next few months.
Yeah, and with the phase one deal, I think a lot of people were skeptical whether or not China would be buying as many beans as they thought they should be based on what the deal was. And as we look through that, they continue to just keep plugging away. They're doing more than what a lot of us maybe were expecting, and seeing that increased demand coming out of the PNW. I think you and I talked earlier this summer where we actually saw basis more attractive in this area than even southern Minnesota. Again, looking at separate export markets, maybe not as much going through the Gulf with that. Also with that, corn's kind of followed. It's started about the middle of August, has rallied as well, not to the extent of what the soybeans has done. Is exports also driving kind of the corn as well, or what do you think's helping push that up?
I think that's a lot of it, is the exports. Rising tide floats all boats type deal. You start buying in one, they start buying across the board. But exports are certainly helping that one. I think there's a little bit less concern because of the sheer magnitude of the carryover that we brought in. It does take some time to get through that. Latest estimate doesn't put us that much different than where we were last year. So yeah, we came off the lowest levels, but I think people are maybe just a little bit more comfortable with corn and where we're sitting carryout wise. And then if you look at that really follows through into the next crop year, because if you look at the 2021 offered levels right now, you have beans that are 2.7 times the price of corn. That's a really strong signal that we need more beans and maybe not so much corn. So I think some of that's, and obviously we have a long time. That can change several times over by the time we get to next March. But right now, that's what the market's telling us. And remember, those same signals are going to South America. Because when do they plant? Well, they start about next month. So those same signals that we're getting, we need more beans, they're getting that same signal there. Plant more beans. So we have to get through their production season in beans before we can make a strong decision about ours.
Yeah, as they're getting ready to go into planting season down there, and they are a little bit dry, I think, going in, and we could probably watch for some weather scares there as well. For us, though, looking at, again, this rally on the soybeans, when you'd say usually we would see the beans off the combine going into town and the corn going into the bins. What's the market really saying? I mean, there's still pretty decent carry on the corn. For the most part, there's really not much carry at all in the beans. Are they saying get rid of the beans off the combine and store the corn, or what do you think the market's saying there?
And that one gets to be a tough call because we have had a narrowing carry environment. We had some strong carries, and you go back to June. I looked this morning, there's only 18 cents from December to July for corn, which really isn't enough to justify keeping it. But that's what you're offered. Now, beans are flat. So yeah, if I had to choose, I suppose I would probably bring beans in off the combine, especially considering the fact that we're the highest price we've had in a few years. We have basis levels we haven't seen in a few years. Yeah, I'd be willing to reward some of that, and I suppose I would sit on the corn a little. But remember, if you have unpriced grain in a bin, it's still unpriced. Whether you decide you want to deliver it in March, May, June, July, it's still not priced. So you have to remember there's risk on those bushels. Now, if the market offers a carry and you want to go sell it out for July, that's fine. You've taken that risk off the table, but just leaving the bins or the grain in the bins and not pricing it doesn't do you any much different than it was when it was in the field. The risk is still there, except for now you have the harvest cost and the storage cost attached to it as well.
So now you're just taking that market risk while it sits in the bin instead of the field. So there's still that risk. Yeah, definitely. And again, it's a reminder for those of you watching virtually, we do have a link in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen if you'd like to send in questions. We are taking questions here today as well. So we've talked a little bit on the corn and the soybeans. Just briefly, let's touch on wheat. And wheat harvest is wrapping up for the most part. I mean, there's still a little bit of wheat out there, maybe up north. What's the wheat market telling us to do right now?
Wheat's a tough one, and that balance sheet really hasn't changed for 3-4 years. It doesn't look like it's projected to change much this year. And the problem with wheat is it's stubborn. What you're going to use wheat for, you're already using it for. People eat it, or last summer we had some feeding it because the price was low enough in the southern plains to attract that. But right now, we're just kind of chugging along. We are seeing some nice movement into Asia, but the U.S.'s problem has always been that we are too far away from the major consumption centers in North Africa and the Middle East buy the bulk of the world's wheat. Well, if you look just geographically, who are the largest producers? Well, yeah, the U.S. is sitting at about 5th, but we also have Russia, we have Ukraine, we have the EU, and they're all just across the Mediterranean. So even if we match them price for price, the freight just makes it tough to get into some of those markets. Asian markets are nice. They like the hard wheats that we grow, but that consumption is pretty stable, and we just don't have a good way right now to tap into some of those better markets.
Again, with as strange as the year has been, 2020, there's been a lot of other things thrown at us. A lot of farm programs. Obviously, it was a farm bill year last year. We talked a lot on farm bill. People signed up for that, whether it was County ARC, PLC. Those prices aren't finalized yet, but generally speaking, we are seeing that we will be seeing some kind of payments from those farm programs, depending on which one people are signed up for. Just kind of a general summary. What do you think you're really seeing on those? Yeah,
they're not quite final, but we should be pretty close based on the September price estimates. So it looks like we'll get about 10 cents a bushel on corn under PLC, 92 cents a bushel on wheat. I don't know if that's good or bad. And as far as ARC payment, most counties will get a max payment under ARC for wheat. It probably won't approach what you would have gotten under the PLC payment because ARC has a cap on it. Soybeans really depends on the county. There are some counties that are getting paid on beans. I know off the top of my head, Lemoore and Dickey are getting some small payments. They're not huge, but they'll get a little bit. There will not be a PLC payment on soybeans, however. That trigger price is $8.40, and we're going to close out the year at $8.58. So 3 years in a row, we've kind of been just over the level of PLC and probably not enough of a yield trigger in most counties to get a payment.
So generally speaking, no PLC on soybeans, maybe some small payments on the county ARC. With soybeans, corn, we have the 10 cents on the PLC and possibly some small payments on county ARC as well, depending on the county and where the yield was at. And then wheat, of course, I think whether it's max payment on ARC County, but also a 92 cents a bushel payment on the PLC. So we'll be seeing those. And those typically come out around when?
They will issue those payments about mid-October. So fiscal year for federal bookkeeping is September 30th. We'll get right into the start of the next one, and they should issue those payments. So within a month or so, you should start seeing those checks come through.
Yeah, I suppose the next question people have is FSA is issuing those checks, and with all the other programs that they're working through, will they get out timely? Hopefully they will. I mean, obviously, definitely, feel for them. They're going through a lot of different things. Some of the other payments, the WIP Plus, we're starting to see, different by county a little bit, but we're starting to see a lot of those payments have come out the last month or so, and some are continually coming out. I know we haven't really heard anything on the last half of the WIP Plus payment, or where that'll be, or where the funding is at. I know there was discussion earlier this week, even here at Big Iron, the Ag Commissioners were talking about wanting to have a deadline put on that for application as people nationwide continue to submit applications for the WIP Plus program to get payments for the 18 and 19 crop year. And then I'm not sure how they're going to apply it to the 20 crop year as of yet, if they do, or do you have any insight if anything on the WIP Plus for 2020?
We don't know yet. They have to declare the disaster, and I guess in eastern North Dakota, there might be pockets, but I don't know that they'll outright declare a disaster. Remember the way that program was set up, there was a payment cap per year, but there's also a total payment cap over 3 crop years, which was 18, 19, and 20. 18, we had some counties in North Dakota and Minnesota, more so to the south, and Minnesota qualified. 19, almost everyone qualified. 20 has to come out of that same pot. So whether they have enough money, and this isn't just for disasters here, that pot is set up for everyone. And WIP itself stands for Wildfire Hurricane Indemnity Program. Well, we didn't have a wildfire or a hurricane, but other places did. In some of those places, it's high dollar crops, it's cotton, it's vegetables, almonds, things like that just take a lot more money to compensate for. And obviously, California has its fair share of wildfire issues right now, and there's a hurricane in the Gulf and one of several. So there's a lot of money that's going to have to go.
And should have asked, just prior to us coming on, they were talking weather, and I should have maybe asked the question, I've heard this is one of the highest number of named storms as far as hurricanes and tropical depressions that we've had, so they're starting to run out of names again. They got to switch after they run out. So it'll be interesting if other states have that damage, and that we do see something in Washington that they do, look at WIP Plus for the 2020 crop year, and then do we get entered into that, especially with the prevent plant. If you think about a disaster area for generally eastern North Dakota, northwest Minnesota, we look at that kind of that southeast corner of North Dakota, a lot of prevent plant down in that area, which hopefully, if anything, we can use that to help qualify for some of those payments, and we see that coming.
Just to add on to that, so starting in August, FSA monthly releases their acreage reporting totals. And it's by state, it's not by county or producer or anything like that. When it came out in August, everything looked light. It just didn't look like, we're like, what happened to all the acres? Where did they go? Now in September, it looked a little bit more in line, and that is partially because of the reporting delays. But for North Dakota, based on FSA data, we're at about 3 million acres of PP, and all of that is sitting in a pretty tight pocket in the south central, southeast part of the state. Minnesota has some, but not a ton. Those numbers will slowly increase. Most of the reporting is done, but it's just the way the counties compile the data. And, I always get the question every year, well, how come USDA has this number, but FSA has this number? And the short answer is those numbers are never going to match. They are just never going to be the same. And part of that is because USDA is looking at all the U.S., FSA is looking at farm programs. Well, you say, well, but there are pockets, and there's even some in North Dakota, people who choose not to be enrolled in federal programs will never show up on FSA data. So FSA isn't designed to match USDA. It's just designed as a metric of, hey, this is what we have for our budget. This is how much money we might need. And so you can get a good feel for it, but you're going to make your head hurt by February if you ever try to get those numbers to match.
Yeah, it's always interesting how the same agency can have multiple numbers there, even though they don't necessarily reconcile with those all the time. So very interesting. Again, talk about a pandemic. We had the CFAP come out this spring based on the market and how everything was influenced there. Are all those payments out as far as the CFAP that originally came out?
They should be. If they're not out yet, the very, very last will be coming in. The enrollment deadline for that was September 11th. So we're past that last enrollment deadline. Most of the people that were going to apply did so in June, maybe into July. So a lot of that money is out. There's always going to be the debate that there is with every farm program, whether it adequately compensated for what it happened, or maybe it should have been doled out this way or that way, or did cattle get enough money? Farm programs are not going to make you whole. They're there to kind of help cash flow the system until you get through. We should be seeing or hearing relatively soon if there's going to be a second half or how they're going to dole that out, and until that point, we'll live with what we have.
Yeah, I continue to hear rumors of a CFAP too. Whether or not that'll actually get through and published out, we'll kind of wait and see on that one. Hopefully there's something in there, but they still have the Heroes and the Heels acts that are not passed in Congress. Is there some funding in there possible for some of our farmers?
It's possible. I think it's hard to say until we get to some sort of compromise, because until that point, everything's up for grabs. Do they give this up to get that? Do they give up, A to get C? We just don't know. And I'd be the last one to try to attempt to explain federal budgeting. So I think it's hard to count on any of that money. But, it's funny you bring up pandemic, because what was also going on in the market, last year and a little bit the year before was the swine flu in China. They had severe drops in their hog herd. Now that seems to be under control, but what we're seeing in the hog market, and which is kind of indirectly affecting corn as well, is that Germany has had a break of swine or fever or flu or whatever they call it, the ASF, and that's an interesting place for it to break. And it's not totally unexpected, because Poland has had it for quite some time. I would say Germany has not confirmed a positive in a confinement facility. What they have is confirmed positives in wild boar population just on the eastern side of Germany coming out of West Poland. That said, Germany is one of the major hog producers in Europe, and they sell a significant amount of their meat to the export market. Not anymore. That's been quarantined, or they have embargoes on it, and that fills a big gap, or makes a big gap in the Chinese pork market. And that will do two things. One, it will help U.S. producers, and we've seen that in the hog market. We've had cash hogs that have just skyrocketed, and as much as everyone said we were behind when the plant shutdown came in April and May, we can't seem to kill fast enough now. The weights continue to come down, meat prices continue to rise. Some of that might be refilling freezers and all that, but that's just kind of comes and goes. This seems more significant than that. So it opens up that market for U.S. producers, but it also gives producers in China extra incentive, even on top of what they already had, to try to expand. Well, where do they get their corn? The U.S. Population numbers are up about 30% year over year already, but I still think there's quite a bit of room, especially lacking German imports, to backfill a lot of that. And when you look at how China is set up, a lot of the hogs are not necessarily located by the corn. And they don't have a good transportation system from the northeast where the corn's located to the kind of the central or southern areas where the pigs are. You can land a boat out of the U.S. into southern China for cheaper than you can buy it out of the northeast and get it shipped around. So there's some things that kind of come into play there that I think long-term really are going to help. And ultimately, where our prices are going to define where these farm programs come out and how much is getting paid. Because if we have good prices, obviously we're not going to get additional farm program. Now, at some point, well, I'd rather have it come from the market anyway, and that's fine. But just kind of underscore that we can't plan on how much or when those farm program payments are going to come out.
Yeah, and it's a good point you make there, Katie. As our prices do continue to strengthen, and we see this in the market, it may be a little bit harder to get approval in Washington for some of this. We have to look back though and see over the last few months, how much damage has already occurred. And it's not the damage we're seeing necessarily today that we're looking for, is we're looking for some of that help throughout the summer months, and people who had last year's crop left in the bins and had to sell. And obviously the livestock sector, hogs specifically, we saw what we had to do with those here this spring as that market tumbled, but it has come back and is strengthened a little bit as the processing plants start getting back on Are we back to 100% on the processing plants, or where are we at, do you think, on that?
As close as you're going to get to 100%. I mean, they did have to put some measures into place to kind of try to get the workers a little bit more space and more plexiglass set up, things like that. So we're as close as we're going to be. And really, the kills are very competitive with where they were the year before. They probably have to run extra hours to do it, but that's their bottleneck. Now, for grains, we have port capacity, and they still have that, obviously, because they have to get on a boat. But our real bottleneck here is going to be processing. How fast can we get from live animal to, product on a plate? And that pinch point has always been processing capacity, and there's a lot of arguments about where that should be, but we're pushing that about as far as we can for right now.
And one topic that the two of us don't really speak a lot on, though, is the dairy market, and that has seemed to correct itself as well. We've gotten a little bit stronger in the dairy market, seeing some good prices there. And I was talking to a gentleman here yesterday, talking about the price of cheese. We went from like a 17-year low to an all-time high in just a handful of months. And so I think the unfortunate part of that, the part I'm concerned about is a lot of that is a little bit government directed based on some of the programs that are put in place that are causing some of that increased demand on processing that milk and getting it to cheese or whatever it is. So that's an area of the market that right now is strong, has a lot of current demand, and where will that lead us to as well. We talked about the hogs have strengthened, the soybeans have strengthened, corn has strengthened a little bit. So there's a lot of upside right now. If you look compared to 3 months ago, yes, the pandemic was kind of a low. A lot of us, went home to work from home, such as myself and you. Middle of March, got sent home and continued to work and do what we were doing, and we saw these prices in markets drop. Ethanol is another one. We saw, obviously lack of use in the ethanol and lack of the people driving, park their car for 3 months or 4 months. How about demand for ethanol? Is that starting to come back?
It has come back. Of all the markets or outlets, I guess, for all the ag products, really, ethanol has had a tough time, and there's a lot of reasons. But you're right, people aren't driving as much. Gasoline demand's down about 10% from where it was the year before. And ethanol is also down about that 10-11%. So it's consistent. I think what we saw starting with ethanol in April is a real test of that industry, and those plants that are efficient are going to stay in business, and those that are maybe a little bit older or are struggling a little bit are going to have to find a different use. We've seen some of that go to hand sanitizer, but even that, you can only handle so much hand sanitizer, and I know we're all using a lot of it, but there's still only so much hand sanitizer that can be absorbed into the marketplace. And so there are plants, particularly in eastern Iowa and parts of Illinois, maybe a few in western Iowa, that are going to struggle.
Yeah, I tell you that gallon of hand sanitizer in my door of my pickup has lasted a lot longer than the gallon of ethanol I put in the gas tank. So definitely it's going to take a lot more hand sanitizer if that's what we're looking for the ethanol demand. So, but again, with that, now the other side of that is because we had ethanol shutting down and not producing as much, as even though we've cut back on our extra supply. I mean, we've gotten a little bit skinnier on that extra supply of ethanol that's out there too, or? That's
the good news is when we really, right away, when they shut everything down around the 1st of April, again, just like an elevator, if you're not moving the ethanol out, eventually the tanks fill up, and then what? You can't do anything with it. You can't process. You just have to wait for it to get moved out, and that part has passed. We've certainly moved through a lot of those supply, and that's good news. We're a lot more balanced than we were, and I think that's going to get rid of a lot of the price volatility. The other thing that's been a long, ongoing battle, and I still don't know that we have a complete answer, is that the administration has said they are not going to grant waivers to backfill some of that blending requirement. And that's gone on for a couple years now. It's been in court, I don't know how many times. But at least at this moment, they said they are not going to grant those. Now that has a lot of things in the market. The first thing that really isn't going to affect farmers directly is these RIN values. So plants among themselves can say, well, I blended this many gallons more than I had to, you didn't blend enough, so I can buy some of your credits over here, and those are called RIN values. Those are probably going to be very high, because how can you possibly, especially when you already had 6 weeks of downtime, how are you going to ever catch up on what you had back going a year or 2 years? So that's an indirect effect, right? Because it's still a cost to that plant to have to buy those RINs, but it doesn't affect the value of the corn or things like that. I think it does provide some support to ethanol market or plants that are going to continue to produce, because they could conceivably get more value for that if they have an overage. But I don't know that it's going to be a big driver more than it is just a support.
I think we must have touched on something there. I got a question in here from online, and with those waivers, not being approved, an election is in the near term here.
Mm-hmm.
Between those waivers and future government programs,
Mm-hmm.
are they just trying to buy votes?
I couldn't possibly venture guess on what their motivation is for providing those waivers right now. I will say that I think we all have to keep in mind that an election is relatively imminent. So first part of November, and how long-standing any of these policies are, what those policies are, if we have a change in leadership, all of this is going to change very quickly. And if we go back to 2016, when we had that election, same thing. We woke up one day and suddenly everything was different. That can happen again. So I think we just have to be prepared that, yeah, we work under what we know today and the circumstances we have right now, but build in some flexibility that you can change those plans, or at least you'll be comfortable and be able to live with what you have set up if those plans do change.
Yeah, and I think to touch on that, it's a good point. Make your decisions based on what we know today. Having that plan, having that flexibility, being able to adapt. The other thing, we do have to look out a little bit and say, could something happen in November that could reverse where we're at? And do we need to adapt our current plan? Again, we've talked about nice rallies in a couple of these markets, and is it time to take advantage of it? That's again up to you and your operation, but I think once you do something like look at your plan, if you do make an action, there's obviously other ways to, I don't want to say reverse it, but still take advantage of some potential upturn, using a broker, getting into some of that other stuff too, other tools. But I think we definitely need to look at what's cash price today, or what's the basis today, where's the futures at today. Do I want to lock in all or part of some of that risk to mitigate it going forward? And again, we have a fairly good idea of what our crop is out there. We don't know exactly. We also have the crop insurance that's out there to fall back on. And so I think that's the other thing to keep in mind is we can safely market, up to our crop insurance guarantee and make sure that at least we've mitigated some of that risk if that's what we want. And then anything up and above that, there's ways to protect that using other tools in the marketplace, or try to have an exit plan to get those sold as well, whether you have a date or a price range set in mind on that.
And I think you touched on something with just risk management as a whole, and this year was maybe an unfortunate but a strong example. We don't manage risk for what we know is going to happen. You don't buy crop insurance because you know your crop is going to fail. That's not how it works. You buy crop insurance in case. Marketing isn't a whole lot different than that. If you would have known that we were going to be hit by a massive global pandemic in April and your prices were going to fall, yeah, you probably would have sold stuff in January and February. But we can't look backwards. So when you're at prices that are comfortable, we have to sell a little bit. And you say, well, if prices go down from here, then what happens to my operation? That's really what we have to manage. And so we try to leave enough that we can benefit from the upside, but also protect the bottom and stuff that's really maybe has the potential to take us out of business or to really limit our options going forward. And it's a tough balance, and I've heard it said before, if everyone knew where the market was going to be, it would never get there. So we can't manage things that way. We just have to go, and everybody has different costs. what works for one guy might not work for another. And so that's where we really have to apply our situation.
Yeah, talking to a farmer here a couple days ago, his analysis was, is a 10-cent increase worth a potential 50-cent decrease? And again, you talk about risk management, and it's like, okay, do I want to put off that 10 cents, wait for that 10 cents, knowing that I could lose 50 or more, we don't know. But as fast as this thing has come up, I always say it seems like we always go down faster than we go up. So I think that we need to be having a plan and be ready to act when those opportunities present themselves. Another question in here, talking PLC. You guys mentioned something about PLC as far as a price per bushel. I assume there's a yield at FSA. Is that update deadline passed?
No, it's getting here very rapidly. End of the month, you need to have those yields into FSA. Those will not apply to your payments for the 19 crop. For 19, they're still going to use your old yields under the 2014 Farm Bill. So you update your yields, you write them out, you sign them, you bring them to FSA. They're going to use 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 to update those yields. Then for 20, those yields are going to come into play, and the PLC will be based off the updated yields. But for the 19 crop year, we're still on the old yields.
So for the 19 payments, we're talking the 10 cents on corn and the 92 cents on wheat. We're looking at your previous FSA yield that was already established. I think in the last Farm Bill, I think it was probably when that one was last updated as well. And then starting for this 2020 crop, which, right now we're a long ways away from 2020 prices being finalized. We don't exactly know where they've actually started tracking them, though, haven't they?
They have started tracking them. I believe they started tracking those in either May or June. But you got 14 months of a weighted average going on here, and this is just the beginning. So that's kind of just this might happen. They're going to fluctuate a lot. I know in August, corn they had projected at 320, for instance, and September we were already up to 350. So they're not going to give you a good idea just yet. But so we'll go for about 12 months now of tracking, and then they will finalize the payment on the 20 crop, and then they'll pay out payments on the 20 crop in October of 21. So there is a lag before you get these.
But early estimates is there's going to be some PLC probably on the crops. Again, long ways from that being even close to final. But your 2020 crop will have the same program, PLC or ARC, as 19. So whatever we signed up for 19 is what 20 has to be?
Yeah, so this is a little bit different. That was a change from the prior Farm Bill. So under the 14 Farm Bill, when it came out, you chose ARC, you chose PLC, and you were stuck in that for 4 years or 5 years, whatever it ended up being. You didn't get to change. This time, they set it up so basically you will choose each crop year if you want ARC or PLC. Because of the sign-up way, the first time you signed up for 19 and 20 all at once. Well, 19, you kind of already had a good idea what was going to happen. You might not have known totally, but you had a good idea. That choice applies to 20. Then this winter, after harvest, I don't know for sure. I'm guessing about January, they'll open it up and say, come into FSA, you have to make your choice for the 2021 crop year. And then you'll choose again between ARC or PLC. And then we'll just continue to do that until we pass the new Farm Bill.
And that deadline, I believe, March 15th?
Yeah, it's the same as crop insurance, because if you sign up for PLC, then you can also add that supplemental coverage option, and that decision has to be made with your crop insurance. So all these dates are all going to line up from here on out.
So there's been a lot, again, 2020 has thrown a lot at us. It's thrown a lot of acronyms at us. It's thrown a lot of different government programs as well, and obviously we've seen the markets react and negatively at first, and has come back stronger than I think a lot of people may have expected here more recently. So with that, again, if there's any questions, keep them coming. I see a few coming here online, and again, anybody from the audience who might have a question for Katie and I, again, talking about agriculture in a year of a pandemic, whether it's the markets or the government programs, we'd be happily able to answer, hopefully be able to answer any questions you may have, unless you give us the hard ones to stump us. So with that, Katie, again, we've kind of talked about a lot of different things here, and as we are starting to get into harvest, again, some soybeans way up north, wheat's wrapping up for the most part. What are the things that you want to encourage that you think farmers really need to remember going into harvest when it comes to marketing or any kind of risk mitigation?
And it changes a little bit year to year, but here's the deal. Once we get to about now, mid-September, at least for the corn and beans, how many guys are at this moment going to sit down and refigure all their break-evens and say, I need this and I need that, and I'm going to have this many bushels and I'm going to need so much cash? No, they're not going to. They got other things to do. So I think when we do have that lull, hopefully, in parts of maybe mid-August, that is the time that we need to sit down and say, okay, my crop looks like this. And yeah, it might change after mid-August, I know that. My crop looks about this much, I have this much storage, maybe I haven't sold anything. Well, chances are if you haven't sold anything, you're still gonna need cash at the end of the year. So how are we gonna manage that? How much storage do I have available? Does it look like a really big crop? Am I gonna have enough bushels? Or enough storage for those bushels? Well, if not, then I maybe better get some things going. But that's why I think maybe looking out a year and having a solid plan a year out, and I shouldn't even say a solid plan, some sort of plan a year out, because now we have a year to work on those bushels instead of 6 weeks or a month. And really time, in a lot of cases, is going to be your friend. Now, this year is the exception. But your choice, I guess, is most years we're going to see some sort of reward for selling a year out. It might be varying amounts. Sometimes it's 20 cents, sometimes it's 30 cents. And then maybe once a decade or maybe twice a decade, we get that year where August the price goes up. Well, holding those 5 crop years for the one time in August that we go up gets to be tough. But if we start working on things a year out, now we can sell a little bit intermittently. And we get to August, and yeah, there might be a little bit of cleanup work, but we're not trying to force everything on what's normally a seasonal low. So I think this might just reinforce how important it is to have an ongoing market plan.
Yeah, I think you definitely hit it, having that market plan, having it there. And like everything with 2020, just having it be fluid. When we have this pandemic, I mean, you guys don't know, we don't necessarily know if the doors are going to be open, if we're going to go to a football game or not on Friday. Living in Minnesota, I don't get to go to football games on Friday night, so hopefully that changes. But everybody has to be fluid with a plan and able to adapt on the go. I think that's really key. I think for agriculture always. This year, I think the pandemic just really amplified it, and we saw those changes move even more drastically, and we had to be ready to act on those opportunities as they presented themselves, and if they did. So. With that, any other last closing comments that you would have for the group?
I think this has been a real test, like you just said, of people's abilities, their management abilities, their ability to adapt. There's been a lot of stress for any variety of reasons over the past year. But I think it's important that we focus on what we can control, because obviously we know that now. We can't control a lot of things that go on. So can I control what price the market is going to offer me? No. I might have a little bit control over my costs, but I don't have any control over the futures board or basis. I can control what price I choose to take. And if I can expand the time that I'm looking at that, I have a better chance of trying to get, a good price. Now I'm saying this and it sounds funny because soybeans are at the highest in 2 years and it's right up against harvest, and I know this, but most years that's not going to happen. So we can't gamble on 2 years ago it went up at harvest. Well, yeah, it maybe did, but we need to just keep looking ahead and have that solid plan. And you know what? You catch up over the whole time horizon, you're going to be better off selling ahead than you are holding until September.
I really agree with that, having that plan, looking out into the future and being ready to act on that. As we do get into harvest, again, I just look at, like you said, Katie, is worry about those things that you can control, and risk mitigation is for those things we don't know that are going to happen, and make decisions for that. As we get into harvest again, just encourage everybody, be safe. There's a lot going on with the pandemic, has amplified a lot of people's attitudes, good and bad in some cases. And so I think also the concern that we have with mental health out there in the ag community, please reach out to anybody. Sometimes it's a AgCountry loan officer, sometimes it's Katie or I, sometimes it's anybody. Just reach out to family, friends, somebody, let them know where you're at and communicate. I think that's very important. And then also, of course, around all the farm equipment during harvest, be safe. We're talking bins, we're talking augers. There's a lot of things out there that can hurt us. So take your time. I know it seems like it's a rush time, but we need to make sure we're safe and stay healthy. So with that, again, Rob Fronning and Katie Tangen with AgCountry Farm Credit Services, we appreciate your time and hope you have a great day.
There's no way to count the number of sandwiches you've packed over the years. Hard to imagine this day would come. Yeah, there's still the same fields, the same roads, the same hard work. But now they're in someone else's hands. And you couldn't be more proud of who you're handing the farm to. No matter what the future holds, AgCountry is here to help you plan ahead.